Hello and welcome to ICF and NewsClick. Today we're in conversation with Dr. Malvika Maheshwari. She teaches political science at Ashoka University. Her first book is called Art Attacks, Violence and Offence Taken in India, and we are here to talk to her about that. So could you take us around the debates that formulated have led to our understanding of free speech?
The limits of political change, especially where free speech of the arts are concerned. The arts are only mentioned once, and they are mentioned in the context of speaking for greater restraints on individual freedom and not lesser, which is the stress on existing norms. Throughout the colonial regime, there were excessive repressive laws to police the arts. The same laws are actually continued and were adopted and expanded once India became independent. Some example is the Dramatic Performance Act, the Cinematograph Act, the different clauses of the IPC. There is some anxiety which is actually born to give individuals too much freedom. And this is actually marked, of course, by the very, very important context in which the debates are taking place, which is the transition 46-47, which is the partition, which is the great violence, stress on public order. These anxieties are actually informing the debates that are happening at that time. And the big sense we get out of the debates is that the Indian masses are not perhaps ready to handle the demands of free speech. We need to actually also focus a bit on who are the people who are part of these debates. They are upper class, upper caste, dominated by Hindu and mostly English educated men. If democracy was to succeed in India, it meant for the people to have faith in these political elites.
Something that is unmissable in today's political climate and today's cultural climate is the attacks on artists. But whenever these attacks on artists occur, the common dialogue in media discourses or even in public discourses is that there are simple binaries between who the victims are and who the attackers are. The other thing that comes up is what is the state doing about it? These are undemocratic. How are they happening today? And how violence is so accessible even in a democracy.
When, one would speak to artists who had been attacked, very often they would say, this is our right to free speech and we demand justice from the state. When I would begin my conversations with some of the people who were at the forefront of these attacks, who led these attacks, they would also argue in the same way. I used to think that they will give me a long spiel about religion or some text that they think that the artist has actually, religious text that the artist has gone against, but actually that wasn't the case. Even when they were articulating that anger using religion, but they were using a language saying that our rights we're not respected. We lose our dignity, right? It is a language of equal respect. It is a language demanding dignity. The second thing which came up again and again was, are we a democracy then? Are we not a democracy? It's not that simple anymore. We need to understand that democracy is a complicated category. Apart from being many other things, democracy is a system where only votes ratify power. Over time, political parties began to exploit every energies of their cadres, their constituencies to actually access that power. If it began with persuasion, it went to coercion. So then for democracy, violence actually became a way to maintain and access this power. The second thing which happened, and at the time when India was a young state, there were many promises that the state had made through the language of the constitution. Very soon, by the second decade into independence, 60s and 70s, what was becoming clear was the failures of the Indian state. A large number of groups and communities at this time actually came up. A lot of political parties in the 70s came up, which used violence as a way to push for these promises. The perversion of this is actually absolutely critical, because the people then who were using violence convinced themselves and convince their supporters that violence is the way to actually access. So violence in this way is not something bad. You're not anti-state, but you're actually ensuring that the state lives up to its promises that it's made. Right? It is difficult to then make a distinction between good violence and bad violence. The second fundamental thing that we need to take into account is that the attacks is not just simply the rise of illiberal sentiments or illiberal language, right? You see, liberalism is a set of values. Liberalism isn't one value. It's equal respect, it's dignity, it's free speech, and so on and so forth. So there is a tension which is inherent within liberalism of which value to actually put first or second. We see one liberal value being pitted against another liberal value, which is the free speech versus equal respect. If we focus on the individuals who are at the forefront of these attacks, and when I say individuals, I don't mean groups, I don't mean organizations and political parties, but actually individuals who are at the forefront. Those who physically assault and vandalize, who do come from a particular social and economic class. And these attacks become a way for them to resolve anxieties around status, recognition, and respect. They are deeply motivated and informed by the glory, the recognition, and power that might have been accorded to their leaders of their organizations who would have used violence in the past.
Even when we talk about forms of collective violence, is a lynching similar to an agitation, similar to a trade union? There has to be some nuance that distincts a mass murder to say just a mass attack on an artist that may not be as violent but just is disruptive in nature.
Since the 80s, since specifically the end of 80s, the attacks on artists has been on the rise. Now, one of the things that every time I would encounter in literature is that it's communal violence or it's political violence, or these were the terms which were used. But actually, from a sociological point of view, I want to argue that it has developed into a very specific form of violence, which I call the violence of offence-taking. If you look at this violence of offence-taking, they are different from riots in the sense they are not as planned as a riot. They are less planned than a riot, yet they are not as spontaneous as a street-side assault. The other thing to understand here is that till today we speak as if nothing has changed from the 80s till today. Actually, no, the logic and nature of these attacks have transformed. Earlier, there was so much stress in literature. What is it that the artist has done that the attack has occurred? To a point today, so was it sexuality? Was it saying something against religion? Was it nudity? These were the issues that one was confronting. But actually, over time, the question of what has completely become redundant.
The other part is that both regimes, both major political parties, BJP and the Congress, have witnessed attacks on artists in their tenure. What is the difference between the attacks that happened in their term, from the 1980s to the 2000s?
More or less government responses, I'm talking about government responses, right, have fallen into four broad categories. First is to completely deny that there is a threat to free speech. Second is to actually provide support to attackers, institutional support or ideological support, political support. The third is to pay lip service that we are all for free speech. And the fourth is to actually come out and support those who have supported the government, including artists. If you look at 1980s, the two big attacks that had happened was the attack on the Satanic verses, which led to the killing of 11 Muslims, and Safdar Hashmi's murder. And what completely goes unnoticed, actually, specifically in the Satanic verses attacks, is that both these kinds of violence on artists had a very, very, very strong criminal intent behind them. It was a moment of criminalization of Indian politics. By the time we come to the 1990s, actually the kind of violence that we speak of is what we call communal violence. So actually from the 80s to the 90s, there were small shifts in degrees, which has over time led to a shift in kind. And what these attacks on artists actually show is the coming together of criminalized and communalized violence. What I find absolutely fascinating sometimes is when a mob, or 10 people or an individual comes to a gallery or to a cinema hall or to a music concert and breaks chairs and breaks the paintings and damages furniture, we always call it that artists have been attacked or it is communal violence. We actually never say that it is actually a criminal act. You know, the Hindu nationalists in the 1980s, we sort of use them under an umbrella term that the Hindu right has attacked. But actually one very big difference between the 1990s to today, which is the decade of the 2000s, and now, what we have seen is actually there are various groups within the larger umbrella of the Hindu nationalists. Of course, the mothership is that one Sangh Parivar, but there are actually a birth of a lot of splinter organizations which have a relation, but which don't follow the same logic of command and discipline.
Let's talk about this political patronage that also is a subset of aesthetic judgments that you know, might drive to patronage offered by the different political parties in power. So what do you think is the difference in the kinds of patronage offered by the BJP and the Congress?
How regulation of the arts has changed, or what is the nature of regulation? So if earlier there were laws and so on and so forth, today the regulation occurs through violence as well, right? Physical violence. But when you speak of patronage, we actually speak of allocation. In what way are we allocating resources? You know, what is interesting is if you look at the museum, the collection in the museums, or if you look at the art institutions, if you look at the kind of patronage offered, be it left, right, I'm not making these, but that patronage happened through a very specific sense of things that needed to be achieved.
Right, right.
And never do we come across an argument of arts for art's sake, especially where administrative institutionalization of art is concerned. It is not just for art's sake. It is for the sake of the state. It is for public order. It is for, you know, what the academies speak constantly, to educate or to better public taste, to educate the citizenry, to inculcate values of secularism. So in this sense, it is propaganda, right? We think that the right does propaganda, but not the left or not the center. But no, actually, the term propaganda is actually then very different, I think.
Right.
And making aesthetic judgments, I think we'll really falter if we say that earlier good art was propagated, or earlier there was no censorship. In fact, there was. There was certain kind, you know, artists who were not. In fact, there are some artists who've been part of attacking other artists over the last few years, whose big grudge is that they were not patroned, they were not offered state patronage, that the state was ideologically biased, right? So the logic of the state then actually, just conceptually, the logic of the state hasn't changed in the sense of propaganda. Now we can disagree that is it secularism, or is it, that's where is the big disagreement, that Constitution says India is a secular state, Constitution does not say that India is a Hindu state.
What other way is there for an artist to proliferate in an environment other than just, you know, align with easier affiliations? Is there even space for an artist to function in an art for art's sake, sort of?
You know, it is very interesting because if you look at the various judgments, right, from Akbar Padamse's, for instance, there is not actually a clear trajectory of where we locate artistic practice. Right? What is it that we expect the artist to do? What is the kind of citizenship that we bestow on the artist? So there are some judgments which say that the artists they have greater liberties, so we may allow them greater liberties.
True, true.
But actually other judgments don't recognize something as artistic speech. They think artists are actually, they have to follow the same set of rules, right? So in that sense, there is no definitive clarity where we've reached as far as placing speech and artists, right?
But then do you think this also puts the artist at the focus of then the storm of, you know, at the eye of the storm, because then the masses begin to look at the artist as an elite who is bestowed with higher privileges, and that which make him evasive of rules that apply to everybody else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where also the suspicion comes from, right? When I was interviewing a lot of the Hindu nationalists, very often they would say, not just Hindu nationalists, right? Even other groups, Muslim groups that have attacked artists, very often just because you're an artist, you can't get away with it. In these entire story of attacks on artists, a lot has to do with education and art education that we have in schools, right? So not just that, so lack of art education at that level of school and college, but also how the market has contributed to this great mystery that art has become. What has happened by the 90s is this great boom in the art market that everybody speaks of, right? Liberalization allowed, opened up that, where different auction houses came to India and, Western auction houses came to India and art prices suddenly went up. But at the same time, media was expanding, which meant that media had a lot more to offer to the Indian public, what you're saying. So, and a common man is reading that art is being sold for
lakhs.
crores and lakhs. So what is it? So anyway, I didn't understand art. Anyway, there was no access to art. And now there is an added mystery to this art, which is the mystery of this unaccountable wealth. Specifically on the attacks on Hussain, one of the biggest arguments which were coming up again and again and again in my interaction with these attackers and with these groups was, what is it that makes it so expensive? So how do you break that mystery? So it is not just the Saraswati that they attacked, there was also the mystery of that monetary value of attack. So if I attack it, then I actually undermine the artist in more ways than one. Then I actually undermine the power that the art plays